Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to be part of this conference. Inspiring talks all day long. My paper will somehow be quite closely linked to what has already been said today. I will speak about higher education and language issues in higher education. As Birute already said earlier, this is a hot topic here in Estonia, in political circles, in academic circles, as well as it raises questions among the general public. And in this paper, I wish to elaborate on the results of my PhD research, in which, as Birute already said, I asked what role different languages play in higher education in Estonia and Latvia, particularly at the national universities, the University of Tartu and the University of Latvia. As this is the Estonian integration conference, so I will speak about Estonia here. In my PhD research, I studied the role of languages in language management, in ideologies and attitudes, as well as a little bit in actual language use. And one of the conclusions I reached was that students tend to make use of a wide variety of linguistic resources they possess while studying at university, sometimes using these languages simultaneously. However, at the ideological level, both the students I interviewed for my research, as well as language policymakers who write legislative texts and policy planning documents, tend to emphasize that while it is important to use multiple languages in Estonian higher education, mixing these languages is not something they would particularly value. In other words, several languages are used in the university setting. At least sometimes it happens that several languages are used to achieve one interactional or communicative aim. This has also been shown by other pieces of research, such as Söderlund in Sweden and Losland in Norway. However, students and language policymakers tend to depict languages as separate, segmented, bordered entities, something that should ideally not be mixed. And in this paper, I wish to elaborate on these findings, to draw more attention to the difference between language ideologies and attitudes, language ideologies and practices in higher education. That is, the ideology of drawing borders between languages and actual language practices in which such borders might not exist. I also tried to elaborate on the question whether the success of the top-down language policies depends on taking actual linguistic practices into account and what could possibly be the benefit of it. The data here comes from documents authored by the Estonian state, the University of Tartu, and the interviews I did with the students of the University of Tartu in 2016. To begin with, there is a growing body of literature on translanguaging, something that has been mentioned for several times today. In my understandings, translanguaging stems from the understanding that dividing languages into named entities is a political and cultural phenomenon. In other words, labeling languages is arbitrary, and named languages such as Estonian, English, and Russian are cultural, political phenomena rather than natural and biological entities. Instead, Leeway, one of the main proponents of translanguaging, argues that human beings might have an innate translanguaging instinct, a capacity to draw on as many linguistic, cognitive, semiotic resources as available to them in order to interpret meaning intentions and to design their actions accordingly. According to his theory that is based on psycholinguistic research on bilingualism, human mind is a holistic multi-competence that firstly does not divide languages into differently labeled languages, language varieties, styles, and registers, and secondly, the human mind does not divide languages from other cognitive and semiotic competencies, such as memory, attention, emotion. Well, this is a theory as long as we don't know what is going on in the brain exactly. But anyway, he does not deny the existence of labeled languages, but he argues that these are politically, culturally, historically, ideologically grounded entities, not what is actually taking place in human interactions. And instead, he argues that humans use all linguistic resources in order to interact. Thus, we move freely between languages, language varieties, styles, and registers. And as a result, he calls monolingualism at an individual level a myth. By contrast, monolingualism can be a reality in policies and ideologies, as it often is that nation states might have monolingual policies despite the fact that different languages coexist in society. The favoring of monolingualism is what Leeway calls the ideology of one language only, and the support to keeping languages apart, pure, is what he calls the ideology of one language at the time. But again, he stresses that these ideologies serve political purposes and do not apply to everyday social interactions during which multilinguals freely move between languages. Furthermore, the ideologies of one language at a time can be observed also in the case of university language policy here. Although the state of Estonia and the University of Tartu support the use of multiple languages in higher education, and in my PhD thesis I have argued that mostly still just Estonian and English are the languages that are institutionally supported. In top-down language policy, languages tend to be depicted as bordered and separate entities, and multilingual practices are not mentioned. The students, however, described their bilingual and multilingual language use in the interviews. I will give you some examples. The examples on the slide show how students make use of their linguistic repertoires in their studies. Even when the courses nominally take place in one or another language, the examples I have chosen show that these students make use of multiple languages they possess in order to understand what they are studying. As I already said at the beginning of my talk, these examples have been gained through interviews with students. Another, possibly better way to collect data on language use at grassroots level would be ethnographic research that I have not done. So the first example illustrates language use of a bachelor student of physics who says that she speaks Estonian as mother tongue. She claims to speak English very well, German well, and have some knowledge of Russian. And during her interview, she says, "Of course, everything is in English in the English medium courses. At times, helpful extra materials are being handed out in Estonian in order for us to understand what we should search for, so that we wouldn't drown in the language. In the Estonian medium courses, materials are mainly in Estonian, but if you want to read some extra materials, these are in English. Whenever we are given something to read in Estonian, we are also informed about the materials available in Russian. I've noticed that Russian medium textbooks are suggested as main textbooks, mainly for Russian-speaking students, but the materials in English are more like extra reading materials. I've sometimes tried to read extra materials in German and Russian. Maybe there's something better than in English and Estonian, just to find better sources." So this is a fine example that shows that although the classes of this student are nominally held either in Estonian or English, the student makes use of her wide linguistic repertoire, in this case to read extra materials in order to understand what is being taught. Another example I have chosen illustrates the same thing from a slightly different viewpoint. In this example, a bachelor student of chemistry who speaks Estonian as mother tongue and claims to speak English and German very well. She has lived in Germany as a child and went to school there. When asked what language has been the most useful for her during her studies, she says, let's say that English has been the most useful, but at the same time, something comes from German, and then it is good to have that extra knowledge, extra language, because you have some weird terminology that you are able to remember more easily because you have that German knowledge. And it is worth to point out that this student claimed not to have used German in any other way during her studies. She said that she hasn't done any readings in German, she hasn't communicated to anyone in German, but she still points out that her knowledge of German is useful for her in order to understand what she is studying in other languages. So this is what I understand by students using their entire linguistic repertoires. In a way, it could be said that there is no switch off to the knowledge of language we have. As said earlier today, we cannot take some part of our linguistic knowledge outside of our heads and put it in a chest of drawers and then continue with some other part. By contrast, here are some excerpts from top-down policy documents that exemplify the legitimating of the ideology of one language at the time, the ideology of drawing borders between languages. The first example is an excerpt from the Universities Act, a state-level document, but the same idea has been repeated in the documents of the University of Tartu. The Act stipulates that language of instruction at universities is either Estonian or a language other than Estonian. In other words, one or another, but not both at the same time, or not several languages at a time. So this is a good example how ideologically languages are being kept apart. The next example is from the development plan of the Estonian language that describes the current situation in Estonian academia as such that students who enter Estonian medium bachelor studies can complete their studies mainly in Estonian, and at times some subjects or subject groups might be taught in a foreign language. Again, for teaching and learning activities within a single course, the medium of instruction is depicted to be either one or another, but not both or several languages at a time. I have two more examples. These come from the interviews again and show that the students who practice translanguaging themselves still tend to overtly support the ideology of monolingualism. Although these students tend to use multiple languages in their studies, they still stress in other parts of the interviews that they would rather prefer studying in one or another language and not to use several languages at the time. So the first example comes from the same bachelor student of physics who I quoted before. In the first part of the example, she says that she describes how she uses several languages in a communicative situation. And the other part of the example that will continue on the next slide will show her overt attitude to mixing languages. While in the first part, she describes using multiple languages, and she says that it feels natural to her. In the latter part, she claims that mixing languages is difficult, so she would rather not do it. So at the beginning here, she describes how she talks to a lecturer that is Estonian, but lectures in English. And she says, when I go up to the lecturer with the question, I ask it in Estonian. It happens in a way that I use English terminology that I know, but my sentences are in Estonian, so this is like a mixed language of Estonian and English. By accident, I've started speaking in English, but then it just feels weird to speak that way. So she describes how mixing languages in this communicative situation feels natural for her. However, in another part of the interview, she says that it is difficult to move between Estonian and English, and I get puzzled, so it's easier to speak one language only. And when asked in which language she preferred to continue her studies, would it be just one language or several languages, she says that she'd like to continue studying in English, and if she'd dare, she'd study in Russian. The final example is from the interview with the chemistry student that I also quoted before. During the interview, she also described using both Estonian and English for reading, for coursing, for communicating with her peers. But when answering the same question about the languages she would potentially like to study in, she says, I'd find it easier if all my studies had been in English from scratch. If you'll continue doing what you're doing, it's good to practice doing it in English from scratch. But at the same time, the beginning is the most difficult part, so I find that at the beginning, the studies could take place in mother tongue. Then you understand and nothing gets lost in translation. So I don't know which way is better. So both of these examples illustrate that while students tend to use their wide linguistic repertoires during their studies, they still believe in keeping languages separate. The examples outlined above show that language practices and ideologies tend to differ. So one of the questions I posed at the beginning of this talk was why? Why do language practices and ideologies differ in the academic context? One of the possible answers could thus be that while we use language the way that feels natural to us, the way it is used, attitudes towards language use in higher education tend to be dominated by the ideology of one language at a time. It could be that mixing languages is not considered to be a sign of creativity and criticality that it could be, but rather a sign of unintelligence and laziness. So it has been shown also by other pieces of research that people, for instance, who code switch themselves, consider it to be something they shouldn't do. Furthermore, I asked whether the success of top-down language policies depend on taking actual language practices into account. And one of the outstanding language policy researchers, Bernard Spolsky, stresses that language management, that is, efforts by certain actors to manipulate language situation, ideologies and practices are not necessarily congruent. However, he says that language practices are the real language policy. It is what actually happens. And the potential of language management to be as real depends on its congruity with actual language use and ideologies. So in the case of language matters in Estonian higher education, I would thus argue that language management might be rather congruent with popular ideologies, but could possibly differ from the actual language use. Some new questions arise. Whether and how to bring language management efforts closer to language practices on the ground. What could possibly happen if language policymakers started recommending more translanguaging practices? Would legitimating translanguaging practices be useful for Estonian or the other way around? Would it have a detrimental effect on the language, taking into account that the number of speakers of Estonian is relatively low in comparison to the number of speakers and the position of languages that we mainly have contact with, that is English and Russian? Would it perhaps be possible that by legitimating translanguaging practices in higher education, we would no longer think that Estonian is losing ground to English in academia, but perceive the situation more as it could be, that is, higher education as a sphere of life where multiple languages, including Estonian, are used and should be used. So all of these questions are up to discussion. I'll add some comments. How to bring language policy closer to language practices? Recognizing and legitimating translanguaging practices would be one opportunity. Would it have a beneficial or detrimental effect on Estonian? Well, translanguaging is an effective mechanism for prestige planning, says Kevin Carroll. In other words, institutional support to languages makes them more prestigious among their speakers. At the moment, I would argue that there are two languages that enjoy wide institutional support in Estonian higher education. These are Estonian and English. And giving institutional support to translanguaging practices, that is, stressing the importance of using wider linguistic repertoires in higher education that students and academic staff possess, could broaden the horizons of language use and thus help fight the global hegemonic role of English as academic language, a very prestigious language in Estonian academia. Another substantial benefit we would gain from legitimating translanguaging practices could be a deeper understanding of how we use language, why we use language in that manner, and so on. Awareness, language awareness, has been mentioned also earlier today. And by we, I mean both language users and language policymakers. So in other words, spontaneous translanguaging seems to take place anyway among multilinguals, but intentional and controlled translanguaging could be a powerful language policy mechanism. Zenoz and Carter write about translanguaging as a sustainable language policy mechanism for regional minority languages, that is, languages that are in close contact with greater majority languages that enjoy more institutional support. They argue that translanguaging could be sustainable for such languages, not only when it happens spontaneously, but when it is controlled and intentional. Of course, Estonian is not a regional minority language. It is a state language used fully in all spheres of life. However, it is still small enough for its users to be in close contact with greater languages as well. So this argument could apply to Estonian as well. Legitimating or understanding translanguaging practices could bring ideology closer to actual practices. We could possibly estimate the threats to the existence of Estonian as the language of higher education and science more accurately. Becoming more aware of our actual linguistic practices could help us understand that, for example, although PhD theses are often written in English and Estonian, that is, the end product is in English, the process good, and I'd think that it often does for multilingual doctoral students, include the use of other languages as well. Think, for example, about the process of writing the thesis. It involves collecting data, discussing results with peers, and so on. Becoming aware of how we use language could help us understand that it is not one or another, but often several languages at a time for one purpose. And using several languages is important for multilinguals for achieving their interactional and social aims, such as getting a PhD. So in conclusion, this talk has just outlined a gap between ideologies and grassroots practices. I would like to suggest and stress that more research into actual language use in academia should be carried out in order to understand the complexity of the matter more clearly. If successful language policy takes into account actual language use and ideologies, these should be studied more carefully before developing policies. Thank you very much for your attention.